So, welcome back. This is part two of the Hare Court employment team bite-sized video on flexible working. My name's Sara Ibrahim and I am here with my colleague Emily Moore. We're both barristers at Hare Court. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Sara.
So last time we were talking about why flexible working would be so attractive. We were specifically going through the legal mechanics of it, and we were thinking that employers and employees may see real benefits to it. And I think in this second part, what we're looking at is how employers should respond, because whilst there is a legal framework, it's very important, I think, that employers have practical advice. So what do we think in terms of how employees and employers should respond? If I could open, I would say that in present circumstances, I think that employers and employees need to communicate. I know this may sound like a very straightforward point, but employment tribunals are having a bit of a backlog, so adjudicating on disputes is going to take quite a period of time. So where you can agree, employer, employee, I think that's so important that you do that. And I think one point that we've discussed previously, Emily, is you can do trial periods. And I think this could be a very attractive option moving forwards.
Absolutely. I think the trial period is a good middle ground. See if it works, and if it doesn't work, then reconsider. But I certainly think, and we touched on this in the last video, that it is going to be much harder to refuse flexible working requests, certainly on those two frequently used grounds that you mentioned before, Sara, so the detrimental impact on quality and on performance, and also the additional burden of cost. So it's clear that a lot of employers have invested sometimes quite extensively in, for example, remote working technology for their employees during this period. For example, laptops and monitors and that kind of thing, even chairs. So if an employee requests to work part of the week at home going forward, it's pretty obvious that the employer isn't going to be able to easily rely on the burden of additional costs reason. And I've already mentioned the detrimental impact on quality and performance, the difficulty in relying on that if home working has been going very well during the lockdown period and the employer hasn't seen a drop in productivity, for example. So what are some of the practical steps, Sara, that employers can be taking at the moment to ensure that flexible working is a success going forward?
Well, just before we move on to some of the practical steps, I think a very interesting observation is a lot of employers have said it's business as usual to all of their clients. And I am sure that a lot of employees are going to be relying on that when it comes to those two grounds about whether there's detrimental quality of their work or anything else, and we'll be saying, well, if we're telling our clients it's business as usual, then how can you as my employer be saying it's not? So I think there may be some people who are going to be hamstrung by what they may have said to their clients and what they may have been putting out on their various social media channels.
Absolutely.
So if you do want to make this a success, and I think it is important that you approach flexible working, whether it is a trial period or not, as something you do want to make a success of. And I remember a point that you made about handbooks. You were saying that you thought it would be a good opportunity for employers to be looking at their handbooks at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the starting point is, it has to be, does your company actually have a flexible working policy? And if not, it's a good time to get one. And if you do already have a policy in place, it's of paramount importance, I think, to be going through that policy now, check, is it fit for purpose? Does it cover all of the current sort of pandemic related issues? Update it and then reissue it. So in terms of other practical steps, Sara, have you got any other particular steps in mind?
Well, I think training is so important, because even though your workforce is probably still working predominantly remotely, you really ought to be investing in making sure that if you are going to be working remotely for longer than just the period of lockdown, that it works. And that includes everybody from the employees themselves who are going to be working remotely to the people who are managing them. Because trying to ascertain whether somebody's being productive, whether the quality of their work is what you want it to be as an employer, you need to make sure there are agreed parameters, because we're all in very, very different territory from where we were in March. My goodness, what a long few months it's felt like. But you can use this time very productively. And I think making sure that you agree what good quality work looks like, what supervision looks like, now that you're not necessarily going to be in the same place. How do you make sure that people are providing work that's of a suitable quality? You're reviewing it periodically to make sure people can make alterations if they've made any mistakes or there have been misunderstandings. That's so crucial.
Absolutely. And I think one other point that struck me was the importance of actually going through the contracts, the employee contracts, and ensuring that they are tailored to address the issues that are likely to arise. So, for example, there's a host of health and safety rules relating to the home office that you might want to implement. Requirements for staff to complete ergonomic questionnaires to ensure that their chair, for example, and seating arrangements are fit for purpose, and a requirement, for example, to attend meetings or training that might not be capable of being conducted virtually. And as you alluded to there, Sara, sort of check-ins with managers, so making those mandatory. So I think it's inevitable that employment contracts will need updating in light of those issues. Anything else?
Well, can I just say firstly, I'm so enthused by this point, because I think people are so reluctant to look at contracts of employment, to look at staff handbooks. It tends to be the case, I'm sure you've seen it in practice, where an employment contract can be drafted when somebody starts and a decade later it hasn't been revisited. Similar issues when it comes to staff handbooks. Now is a really good time to be investing into your business and into your workforce to make sure everybody knows what's expected of them and what they can do. So I think your point is particularly pertinent at the moment, and I'd encourage people to be thinking about that. But just picking up on something you said, I think really been alluded to, which is risk assessments. I think very few people traditionally think about risk assessments, and there can be some confusion that if somebody's working from home that there's no obligation whatsoever. And that point that you made about where people are working physically from home is such an important point. I'm sure you've seen all sorts of photos of people propped up on kitchen tables and rickety desks, and some people trying to work from their beds and all sorts of things. And whilst that may have been a novelty at the start of this pandemic, if you are an employer, you really need to make sure that people aren't going to be doing themselves a physical damage by sitting or working in a way that's uncomfortable. And that duty particularly applies to pregnant women. So you need to be looking at particular risks facing them. You may want to be thinking about any disabled employees you have as well. But I think there are a couple of other points, Emily, that you just very briefly wanted to touch upon.
Yeah, that's true. And I should say just before that I have invested in my own sort of ergonomic chair. So I've definitely, I've experienced the pain induced by trying to work on chairs and sofas that are not fit for working. But yes, Sara, and so a couple of final points very briefly. Insurance. So employers should be checking the details of their insurance. Are they covered for employees working from home if they're using business equipment, for example? I think that's absolutely essential. And finally, a large topic that we will be covering in a later video in this series is data protection issues. There's a whole host of those, so I think that is too large to try and cover in this talk. But we will endeavour to address that at a later date.
Great, thank you very much, Emily.
Thanks, Sara.